Hi, this is Paul, and I have that's something I'm really looking forward to. Speaking with Father Conor McDonough, and he is one of the participants of the Galway event that we are doing in February. I'll put a link to the event below. Tell me a little bit before we get into your story. Tell me a little
Mm.
bit about where we're going to be having this event, and because I'm super excited about that too.
Yeah, it's a fantastic place. So it's on the west coast of Ireland, just overlooking Galway Bay, which is kind of an iconic location for a lot of Irish Americans. There are a lot of songs about Galway Bay, so we'll be literally walk out the door of the church, and there's Galway Bay right in front of us. And the area is called the Claddagh. And Claddagh, it comes from the Irish word cládach, which just means a rocky shoreline. So it was the Irish speaking area just outside the walls of medieval and early modern Galway. Galway city was kind of a colonial town, an English speaking town. And outside the walls, you had this Irish speaking fishing community. And that's where we're going to be. It's famous for the Claddagh Ring also. So a lot of Irish Americans and more than Irish Americans would know this ring. It was actually in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, believe it or not. The Claddagh ring plays an important role. It's a ring that has a heart and a crown over the heart and hands kind of on either side of the heart. And that's kind of an engagement and marriage ring associated with this area. So it's a place of real deep tradition, real natural beauty. So it's a really great place to gather people.
Well, I am so looking forward to this. You and I will be speaking with Paul Kingsnorth and Martin Shaw, and there's a fifth participant in this as well.
Yeah, Father Paul Murray, who's a Dominican friar like myself, he's out in Rome. He's an extraordinary character. He was a spiritual director to Mother Teresa. He was a professor of spiritual theology in Rome for many years, and he's a published poet. He's written poetry for many years. He did his doctorate on T.S. Eliot
Oh,
and kind of
wow.
mystical theology in T.S. Eliot. And so he'll be reading some of his poetry in the evening and taking part in the panel discussions earlier on. He's a wonderful man.
Wow. I feel extremely out of my depth in this whole thing. I
Not at
certainly
all.
do. But
Not at all. We're looking forward to having you.
I'll be yeah, it's my life has taken strange turns in these last 7 years. But let's get into you because you're you know in I made your acquaintance through Mark,
Hmm.
who's obviously fairly well known in the corner from More Christ. And and then I said, and we were talking at a sort of an organizational Zoom for this event, and you started telling me some things. I thought, oh, I want to get to know this guy better, especially before a conference like this, because I've spoken with Martin Shaw, I've spoken with Paul Kingsnorth. I did an
Hmm.
event with Paul Kingsnorth in Ireland that Marcus put together. So I'm gonna do a little bit of what I usually do with people. So I'm a Christian Reformed minister, and I do like Protestant ministerial things with people just to sort of get their story and get to know them a
Hmm.
little bit better. So tell me a little bit about the home you grew up in.
Mm. So one of six kids, five boys and a girl, and I grew up not far from here at all, just the other end of the promenade, which kind of goes down the sea. So I'm back home for the first time now since I was 17, and that's a real joy. So very sporty family, very committed Catholic family. Also, mum and dad, very different faith they had from each other. The mum was kind of involved in the Catholic charismatic renewal. So that was very much a part of family life, praise and worship. To hear mum just praising God in the kitchen was a normal experience. But also we had kind of traditional Catholic devotions like the Rosary, and my dad was also very committed to those. And they had a real serious faith that was tested by tragedy, like in so many family lives. So that was a real blessing to me growing up, just to be brought up in that context of very sincere and profound faith. I mean, my mum, my kind of abiding sort of memory of her growing up is, she's fed us all, cooked for all the children. She clears the kitchen, and then she gets out her Bible, and she's just studying the scriptures. And her Bible is just covered with notes. And within her prayer group, she would teach the scriptures to her friends. It's just tripping off her tongue. And I mean, when I study theology, and I could spend years studying a topic, and I go to mom and I share some insight that I've got, and she'd just add something to it, and I'd realize, my gosh, it's like you climb the mountain and she's already there,
Yeah.
just by the grace of God and her own reading of scripture. And actually, she said something to me a while back, um, that I hadn't heard before about the Ark of the Covenant. And I said, Mum, where are you getting that? Did you hear that in the God channel? Like, where's that coming from? And she said to me, Connor, have you not read Second Maccabees recently? And I had to say, no. And so she whipped it out and showed it to me. So anyway, that's the kind of the family I grew up in, and it was a real blessing. Yeah.
When did you get a first sense of calling for the ministry? Are you the only one among your siblings that has pursued this?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, quite a few of them are committed, and have a strong sense of kind of, missionary discipleship, in their own lives. But I'm the only one who's in a religious order, who's ordained. So I guess very young, it was kind of there. My mum's mum gave me a book called 60 Saints for Boys, and I remember reading that and just thinking, Saint Benedict, Saint Cuthbert, all these guys, they had it right. So like my imagination as a child very much was kind of set alive by that. But then as a teenager, kind of drifted, and you're kind of thinking about other things, and it came back with a bang really when I went to university in England. So I was 17, went to college, in Cambridge, doing physics. That was my main kind of focus, and yeah, it really came back with a bang there, because I was suddenly out of a broadly Catholic context into very much a non-Catholic context. All my presuppositions about the meaning and purpose of life were kind of thrown into question, and I had to address them all, think about them all, pray about them all, and I had to study and read and make friends in the faith and outside the faith, and talk about all these things. And the great thing then, which I think has been somewhat lost since, so this is kind of 2004, 5, 6. We had really, really good conversations among, with non-believing friends, believing friends. You could talk about anything. And 3 o'clock in the morning over the worst beer. It was called Grosh. It was just a horrific poison. But we would drink that and just talk about everything and really say what we thought.
Mm.
And there was no sense in which I felt in any way censored, and I wasn't censorious with regard to others either. So we had these amazing conversations. But within that context, I really felt a growing call to share what I was firmly convinced is true about the world, about this life, about salvation, and that wouldn't go away, and it kept nagging
Mm.
me. And we set up a little group for friends who were thinking about vocation, and yeah, it just kind of grew within that context. And once I got to know the Dominicans and their long tradition and their kind of current setup in Ireland, I just said, I got to try this out. I tried it out for a weekend and came back for another weekend, and entered the novitiate then in 2009. And since then, I've never once doubted that God wants me here. I've sometimes regretted that God wants me here, or questioned why, but I haven't doubted the fact of it.
What what was it like? I mean, obviously for Protestants and Catholics, there's obviously a division, because you take on some pretty significant vows that are
Mm,
going to shape your life in an extraordinary way. Um, you know, uh, Hopefully for the rest of your life. I mean, that's
yeah.
the reason you take these vows. What was the response like from your family and your peers for this?
Yeah, it was surprisingly positive. It was something that I found somewhat hard to kind of talk to people about initially. My family never even kind of proposed it to me, or suggested it to me before. There was zero pressure from parents or brothers and sisters. Some of my siblings weren't all that happy, and they kind of thought of it as a bit of a waste. Although they've very much changed their tune on that since. Um, and a lot of my friends, I suppose, their attitude was, whatever makes you happy, man. Is that kind of an attitude, which is actually kind of harder to engage with. Um, it's just kind of, yep, you do you, and I'm delighted. And they've been really loyal. I mean, they've been really, really
Mhm.
loyal to me, and really, they've remained wonderful friends, those friends I grew up with. And in some cases since then, there's been kind of an opening of a door, a kind of deepening of conversation with individual friends. Um, but on the whole, it was kind of that sort of, yeah, fair enough. If it makes you happy, go for it. But I could have been saying I'm going to, do all kinds of crazy things, and they would have said, yeah, go for it. So yeah, so there was very little, very very little negative response, and mostly encouragement. Yeah.
When you say try it out for a weekend, what does that
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah, well, this is something you do when you're discerning a vocation to religious life or priesthood. You go on dates, and it's something I'm always encouraging, guys and girls to do if they're thinking about that this might be a possibility for them, is to actually not just to think about it or to dream about it or to pray about it on your own, but actually go and live the life for a while. And things become they really are clarified by that experience. You'll know pretty quickly if you're definitely not made to live X form of life.
Mm.
In the Catholic Church, the various forms of religious life are quite different from each other. Um, and so you'll get a sense very quickly, this is not what I was made to do. So that's, yeah, you go for these live-ins, which might be a weekend or a week or a month. And eventually then you enter, you don't take final vows for usually about 5 years or so.
Okay.
So for all of those initial few years, it's all provisional. Yeah.
Well, that sounds very wise. I just on Sunday we have Protestant churches, and membership is sort of, well, everything about Protestant churches is all over the map. But I when in terms of people actually becoming members of my local church, I usually encourage them. I want to see them here for a year or two until
Mm,
I know who they are, that they fit in, they're already sort of doing things, they're
mhm,
part of the life, and then it's like, okay, well now, now you can sort of make the commitment. So,
mm,
what surprised you about this, that say, I mean, you grew up Catholic, you obviously
mm,
understood the church, you were around it culturally, there was a fit,
yeah.
but what surprised you about this vocation?
I think what surprised me was, and I suppose it's obviously true in some sense that you become a living, walking symbol, and that's kind of the purpose of religious life in the life of the church, in the same way that a married couple represent Christ's fidelity to the church,
Hmm.
insofar as they live out their fidelity to each other. So, as a religious, you live out this kind of symbolic function. You're saying, just by your very existence, you're saying that there is more to life than earthly pleasure. There's more to life than marriage. There's more to life than just earthly life. And so, you're what the documents of the church say is, you're an eschatological sign. Um, but what surprised me was the extent to which people respond to you as a symbol rather than as a person. And it should be kind of obvious. I should have expected that. But that was challenging initially.
Mm.
For a long time, you're kind of saying, "Hey, just get to know me,"
Yeah.
because some people will respond to you in a really negative way because
Yeah.
you are this sign, kind of sign of contradiction in many ways to what they might be interested in, or they respond to you excessively positively, and you're kind of on a pedestal, and they're saying, "Oh, you're the future of the church," and aren't you wonderful? And both of those I found, well, especially that last one, I found really difficult and nauseating, because with any amount of self knowledge, that that's not a good thing to hear. Anyway, so I think that was kind of a surprise, was the extent to which you're a symbol and people respond to you as a symbol,
Mm.
and they might eventually get to know you as a person. But yeah, that was quite challenging for the first few years.
I can imagine, and there's some of that with Protestant clergy as
Of
well.
course.
My father, so I'm third generation minister in my family.
Oh
My
well.
my grandfather was, and my father was, and I am. And the clerical collar came off for my father in the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
And, my father pastored a small inner city, mostly African American congregation just outside of New York City.
Mm-hmm.
And I really like how you framed it, because, if you're wearing a clerical collar, people do see the symbol first, but they fill that symbol
Exactly.
with whatever they have.
Exactly.
Um, talk to me a little bit about I went to Ireland. The only time I've ever been to Ireland, Marcus did an event at the priory that he was working at
Oh,
in
Benverb.
Northern Ireland,
Yeah.
and we did an estuary event where we sort of
Mm,
Paul Kingsnorth and I had some time basically talking together and talking to the group, and then we sort of broke things down into little estuary groups whereby huddles of 6 to 8 people, and it was
mm,
fairly free form. And it was very interesting for me because I found that the people that we gathered, well, so you have a Protestant minister, you have Paul Kingsnorth, now recent Orthodox convert, and in a Roman Catholic priory. So you're going
mm.
to get a diverse group coming to that.
Yeah.
But I was surprised at the both the diversity of the group in terms of people from different Christian churches, different Irish
Hmm.
Christian churches, but also people who, let's say, were not necessarily religiously observant from whatever tradition they might have come from or were interested in. And and then the one of the other things that the group that people expressed surprise at this event was how they could sort of talk openly and share openly about their thoughts and
Mm,
experiences with others from other groups. So it sounds, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but what I took from that is that Ireland is expressing sort of a new experience of religious pluralism, which is obviously Ireland has had the reputation of a deeply Catholic country.
mm,
And so it's how does that look from, let's say, the place of your vocation now
mm,
as you're watching changes in, really place you grew up in?
mm. Yeah, and there's a few different questions there. I mean, the the point about kind of a growing secularism, let's say, or religious pluralism, leading different kinds of Christians to come to know each other a little bit better and to live in a greater sense of solidarity. I think that's very true. Um, in the north of Ireland, there's a real intense sectarianism and tribalism, which has very little to do with theology. It's not as if the more religious commitment people have, the more commitment they will have to the sectarianism. It doesn't, plot like that at all. So what I find now is that people who are serious about their Christian faith experience a kind of a strong sense of brotherhood, especially in as Ireland north and south becomes more secular. That's definitely my experience. That new conversations have emerged with groups of people who just they wouldn't have had those conversations wouldn't have happened. Let's say 20, 30, 40 years ago, just simply because the sectarianism would have prevented it. Just one example of that in the past, when we were children, as a family, we went on holidays to a place in the north called Port Stewart. And it was our first time in the north. We were all pretty nervous because at the time we were hearing on the news about all these bombings and so on. And at one point we went to a beach, which we didn't realize it was kind of in a majority Protestant area. And we were pretty naive about these things. And mom was kind of calling out our names, Conor and Marie, Damien, like they're not Protestant names. And people are kind of looking around a little bit. And mum decided she was just going to start talking to the people around her, set up her own little estuary group. And she ended up, she's an incredible gift for conversation. And she ended up having a really profound conversation with somebody sitting next to her. And about an hour later, this woman said, "You're the first Catholic that I've ever spoken about my faith with for
Wow.
my entire life. I've never shared." So this person was a very committed Christian, but had never had any kind of a faith conversation with a Catholic. So those kinds of things now are much more possible, I think. And growing up in Galway, the sectarianism, we just didn't have any sense of sectarianism locally. There's a tiny Protestant community. I didn't really know any Protestants growing up, except in a group of Baptists who ran an ecumenical cafe. They set this up when I was a teenager. It's called An Toranua, and it's Baptists and Catholics working together to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. It's still there. I don't know, 30 years later. and they have an immense outreach to young people in Galway and beyond Galway. So growing up, I was really comfortable in that environment. Very, I would say, confidently Catholic, and I didn't ever really have major doubts about the Catholic faith, but I was just super comfortable with Protestants, and I think that is more common now.
Mm.
And I'd say in terms of outreach in let's say where I am now, I very much see local Protestant communities as allies. As I said, they're really small here,
Mhm.
but I delight in kind of fellowship with Protestants here and Orthodox and whoever it might be, in the university and just around the city, and it's a great thing that is possible now.
That's so interesting. What, um, well, first of all, what's your what's your day job like in terms of the focus of your work? Are you doing mostly scholarship now, or what kind of things are you doing?
Well, right now, since September, I'm a full-time PhD student. So my day looks like kind of 7:20 in the morning. I celebrate the morning mass and have my morning prayers and so on, and then 8:30 I'm in the university until about 4. So
Wow.
I'm doing a PhD, and then we have our prayer times in the evening and other kinds of meetings in the evenings. So that's the kind of the structure of my days generally now. Is full time research, but for the last number of years, I was in Dublin in the North Inner City. Very different kind of experience. You could have very chaotic days. I was teaching theology to our trainee friars, so teaching all the dogmatic or systematic theology courses, and also very kind of linked in with the local homeless community, chaplain to a shelter for homeless women. All the time, you're meeting people who are dealing with drug addiction, and you're also going around very regularly giving talks in different places. So that's one thing as Dominicans that we do. We regularly go out and give talks. We're not just focused on our own little parish. We're meant to be much more mobile and accessible, which can be exhausting. Even Ireland is small. I know for Americans, Ireland is a very, very small place, but we feel like it's a big thing to cross the country. For Americans, it's nothing. But for us, it's a big deal. So yeah, so a lot of I still do a lot of travel like that, giving talks here and there to different groups of people.
Tell me about the decision to get a PhD. What are you studying and why? I mean, I would also imagine for you to make this decision to get a PhD. This isn't just your decision. I would imagine this is in communion with I don't know who else, but I would
Experience, yeah.
imagine it's a communal decision.
Yeah, so we're organized. We have a certain kind of a hierarchy in the order. We're all brothers with each other, but there are some brothers who have responsibility for the common good, the common life. And so in Ireland, it's the prior provincial who makes decisions like that, along with somebody. And this is kind of unique in the Dominican order. We have also somebody who's responsible for the intellectual life of the province, and there can be sometimes conflicts between those two. So you have, a provincial is thinking about making sure that all the churches have people to minister to them, that there's good pastoral offerings and so on. And the region of studies is thinking, well, what about the intellectual life? What serious theological thought is happening? How are we, forming new teachers who actually have gone very deep in the scriptures and very deep in the theological tradition? So there's a really nice dynamic there, but it can be a challenge as well. So in any case, my provincial is very supportive, and my region of studies of doing further studies, doing a PhD. It's to some extent it's expected if you're able in the Dominican order, that you'll go and at least do what's called a license, which is kind of a higher master's in theology, but also to do a doctorate if possible. And there's plenty of positions in the order that almost kind of not don't require a doctorate, but it's certainly expected. So what's unusual for me is that I'm not doing it in an ecclesiastical faculty, but I'm here in the University of Galway, which is a secular university, and I'm working on in the Department of Classics. But actually, I'm working on early Irish Christianity. So that's the focus of my research. 8th century, 9th century Irish biblical exegesis, and specifically how they read the letters of St. Paul, how they interpreted St. Paul's letters in 7th century, 8th century, 9th century Ireland. So that's the focus of my research, which is fascinating. It can be pretty dry because you're really looking carefully at manuscripts. I mean, literally today I was looking at hairs on manuscripts and so on, and looking at individual letters, trying to figure out these things. So it's the really hard work of philology, but at the service of understanding how the intellectual life of the Irish Church functioned at that time.
That is super interesting. It's interesting because Irish Christianity, even in a lot of Protestant circles, here in the United States,
Mm.
it's had some really hot moments. There have been times when, Protestants have been super geeked about, Irish Christianity
Yeah,
and
St. Patrick. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And, there've been some books written that have sort of piqued people's
Mhm.
interest. And obviously in terms of what's going on now with Jonathan Peugeot, interest in symbolism,
Mm.
Paul Kingsnorth and, his wells
Mm.
and and it's I'm also super interested in history of interpretation
Yeah.
because, I regularly have to every week I have a sermon to plan and to deliver. And it's always fascinated me how different times, different cultures, different places. I was a missionary in the Dominican Republic with Haitians
Mm.
before I came here to North America. My grandfather preached in churches which were predominantly Dutch immigrant, usually rural farming communities. My father spent most of his vocation in an African American context just outside of New York
Mm.
City. I'm in a multi everything location in on the west coast of the United States. In the United States, it was sort of Patterson, where I grew up. It was sort of African American, and then the Dutch Christian Reformed people, Dutch Calvinists.
Mm.
But here in California, you've got Asian, Pacific Islanders, Hispanics. I mean, just and so you become quite aware that interpretation, especially for Protestants, who of course prioritize the scripture, let's say, rather than the tradition.
Mhm.
Um, it's obviously a big deal. Did you choose this topic? What interested you about it?
Yeah, I did. And I had looked at other possibilities. So I had another doctorate kind of planned and lined up, which was about, it's still related to the Bible, but it was going to be about a long Irish language poem written in the 10th century, which retold the history of salvation in vernacular Irish poetry, which has never been edited. And it's sitting there in manuscript form and has never been edited. And it would have been fascinating to see that imaginative retelling. And what I'm looking at is not as imaginative and it's not as symbolically interesting. There's not much allegory. The the Irish exegetical tradition tends to be far more interested in who, what, when, and where. It's rare that you get a kind of an allegorical flourish. It happens, but for the most part, they're really interested in establishing, just clarifying the text. What does it actually mean? And so you have these very early manuscripts with lots of glosses in the margins and interlinear glosses as well. So there's one that I work on, the Würzburg glosses, which is Paul's letters, and there are literally thousands of glosses, mostly in Latin, but a good maybe a third of them, I think, are in Old Irish. So this is one of the main manuscripts which is used to reconstruct Old Irish as a language in that period.
Wow.
So you have, yeah, but a lot of it you kind of expect some really kind of interesting theology here, or interesting symbolism, especially if you read the lives of the Irish saints, all this kind of wacky stuff. You kind of expect some of that here. You don't tend to get it, at least not so far. You get some strange stuff, but mostly they're kind of basing it off Jerome, Augustine, and surprisingly, Pelagius. This is really strange. Pelagius is, and I mean, I don't want to
Yeah.
trigger a Calvinist, but Pelagius is huge for them. Now, they're not Pelagians, and they're pretty committed to an Augustinian understanding of grace, but they seem to just regard Pelagius's commentary on Paul as being just a really good commentary and really helpful, and so they're constantly referencing Pelagius in these margins and so on. So I'm going to go through that to just to investigate that. I mean, were they Pelagian? Were they actually committed to any of his doctrines on grace and free will, or is it just for kind of factual matters and clarifying, who is this person, who is Lydia, or whatever it might be, yeah. So that's the kind of stuff that I'm investigating.
That is super interesting. Well, I don't know if I'm asking an impossible question, but can you sort of give me a sense? I mean, you've already sort of set it up. Give me a sense of, boy, you see, it's so foreign to me that are most of the documents you're looking at sermons?
Right. None of them are sermons. So there's one of them that I'm editing the Pauline section of it, and it is, as far as I know, it is the first attempt to provide a compilation of commentary on the whole of Scripture. It's from the mid 8th century, and it's known by different names. It's known as Das Irische Bibelwerk, because Germans, it's always Germans who work on these things first. So it was a German scholar who gave it that name. It's known also as Pauca Problemata, a few problems. That's a really typically Irish thing in that period, to title your work a few problems, a few questions. That's very, very typical at the time. So that's a commentary on all of Scripture. Now, it's not going through it line by line. It's more kind of what weird questions emerge when you're reading Ephesians. Let's look at 3 difficulties in Ephesians, and then let's look at Colossians or whatever. So I'm editing that section from that work, Pauca Problesmata, the Pauline section, and it could just be like, here's what Jerome says about this. Here's something interesting Augustine says. Here's something that Eucharius of Lyon says. So it's a compilation of patristic commentary and then occasional original comments as well. But then many of the other works I'm looking at, the manuscripts will just be a manuscript of Paul's letters, along with some other things sometimes. And in the margins, you will have comments and glosses. And there's a tradition. It's not as if each person writing this manuscript is writing down their own set of glosses. There's a tradition. They're copying from another set and maybe another set as well. So you're trying to figure out the relationship between these things. And so there you read. It's like the what you call it, the Torah, and then the Masoretic comments in the margins and so on. So you have the Masorah, isn't that what it's called? You have these comments in the margins. So it's this sense of Scripture being transmitted, but along with a tradition of interpretation as well on the same page. And this gives rise ultimately to what's called the Glossa Ordinaria, which is a really kind of a fixed set of patristic commentary that went in the margins of Bibles, even in the printed era. But this is well before the Glossa Ordinaria, well before any kind of fixed marginal commentary, and it's in flux, and the Irish are major contributors to it.
That is super interesting. Well, I want to sort of locate this because, part of what I'm interested in now is the fact that we are in a moment now where Protestants, Catholics, and Orthodox can have conversations together.
Yeah.
And practice, I mean, it's so interesting as you talked about your mother's faith. Practice amongst, I'm not going to talk about the Orthodox because they're pretty new to me, but Catholics and Protestants in terms of personal Bible reading, is probably increasingly common, over the divide, and I very much celebrate that. It also, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I suspect that in a period like the 8th, 9th century, most of these conversations that you are overhearing now via reading what they wrote, these are conversations between what today we might call scholars.
Yep.
These are, and it's also fascinating watching, let's say, with this sort of Orthodox resurgence in the West, a lot of interest in church fathers. And, many of these church fathers, these are not people writing for popular audiences. There's no such thing in many ways before the printing press of a popular audience. You're highly literate, wealthy enough to purchase books or part of an institution, a religious institution that will manage all of this stuff.
Yeah.
And so then the, let's call it the, I don't mean it in a derogatory, but sort of the chatter between clergy and academics and scholars trying to interpret Paul,
Yeah.
especially if you're not in a context where, like for myself as a Protestant minister, I have, a wall full of commentaries, and
Hmm.
every week I spend time obviously studying the texts, looking at commentaries, trying to get a sense of something. But it's always to the fact that I have a half hour,
Yeah.
sermon to give to my people. And so that obviously shapes the manner of chatter going on. And one of the things that you learn, I learned in seminary is that certain commentaries, especially of a certain era in the modernist period, so many commentaries, they were fixated on, let's say, source criticism or
Sure.
form criticism. When I, as a minister, I'm talking to people who are trying to live out their lives, and it's like they don't care about J, P, and E, and they
Yeah.
don't, all of this stuff that was happening tended to happen a lot in sort of the modernist period.
Yeah.
How when you're reading these conversations between people, obviously, who are deeply trying to make sense of the Pauline text, how did that then get translated or filtered down into the church itself? I mean, it's
Mm.
it's probably not coming down through homilies necessarily then, but probably through formation of what? I'm super curious
Mm.
about that.
Yeah, no, that's a really important question, a really difficult question. It's one that's at the back of my mind all this time because you're right. This is a scholarly conversation, um, and even asking like what motivates these scholars to do this work is an important question as well. There's a beautiful one of the most famous Old Irish poems, so a poem written in the Old Irish language, is by a monk who compares his scholarly work to that of his cat, his pet cat called Ponger Bon, who's this white cat, and he describes the cat chasing mice like I chase the meaning of words. And it's a really beautiful poem. He says this cat is really good at his art, and I'm working hard at my craft as well. So I suppose for these scholars, there's perhaps a sense in which it was just a kind of a natural thing. If you were able to do it, you would do it. It was just kind of part of the monastic life, um, maybe part of monastic excellence. Definitely from very early on. Possibly one of the oldest poems written in Irish, although my PhD supervisor disagrees, in fact, and he edited this text, is called Avra Cholam Killa, and it's a description of the virtues of Saint Columba of Iona, who's one of the earliest Irish saints. And it describes him working very carefully on the biblical text as a scribe. It's possible that the oldest surviving Irish manuscript is called the Cach. It's possible, and scholars, even skeptical scholars, say it is possible that he wrote this manuscript. You can see it in the Royal Irish Academy today, and it describes him going through his biblical text with the obolos and asterisk. So these are the annotation symbols developed by Origen in the Hexapla. So in other words, right from very early on, Irish monasticism was very ascetic, but also very interested in the biblical text. And so the ideals of the monastic life, clearly, there was some, the study of the Bible played some important role in that. But it's a massive question in scholarship today. What kind of pastoral care was there beyond the monasteries in Ireland? And that is a really open question. And there are kind of two different schools of thought. Some argue that in that early medieval period, pastoral care was minimal, and others argue against that. But the evidence for it either way is really really slight. Um, Having said that, I find it hard to imagine that it was minimal. Again, if with Saint Patrick as a kind of an early ideal, this kind of missionary ideal, surely it has to have had some impact on their ideals at their best. The idea of preaching to the ends of the earth, must have been there in their imaginations. But yes, it's really not clear what the ordinary Christian experience of the Word of God
Hmm.
was. Um, Definitely, there are indications that um, the Eucharist in which people would have participated, that there were popular understandings of the symbolism of the Eucharist based on moments in the Gospel. So there's an old Irish treatise on the Mass, which goes through the various moments in the Mass and correlates them to the various different moments in the life of Christ. So this seems to represent a kind of a teaching about how to participate in Mass that was probably given to lay people. So if you're not sure what to think about at this point, think about this, think about that. And the other element of kind of popular communication is the high crosses. Um, and these are now a lot of people think the high crosses are far older than they are. The oldest surviving high crosses are kind of 9th century and 10th century. That's the kind of the great period of for these high crosses, which is kind of the circle usually around kind of uniting the arms of the cross. Um, but they probably had wooden precursors. That's almost certainly the case. And these stone high crosses that survive, they are scripturally immensely rich. I mean,
Hmm.
really incredibly rich in scriptural detail. So we have on our YouTube channel, Irish Dominicans, you'll find we have a video about the Moon High Cross, Moone, and another one about the Castle Dermot High Cross. And we just explore, if you have a man playing the harp next to Christ on the cross, that's David. And what this is saying is that in order to understand Christ's crucifixion and resurrection, you've got to read the Psalms, because that was immensely clear, at least in the scholarly literature that survives. And the High Cross at Moon, you have all these stories of liberation just in panels on the cross. So you have Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the three young men in the fiery furnace. You have the flight into Egypt is represented as well. You have the near sacrifice of Isaac on Mount Moriah. So you have all these stories of liberation. And clearly, what they seem to be saying is that's what the cross is about. So again, we can't be sure how this was communicated to the people, but it's very unlikely, I think, that crosses like that were only for an elite understanding. I think it's far more likely that we're seeing here popular preaching based on the stories of salvation.
Hmm. That is so interesting. And to me, something must have been working.
Yeah,
Part of what we're going to talk about in Galway is civilizational Christianity.
yeah,
And, Paul Kingsnorth just gave that Erasmus lecture at First
yeah,
Things, which was super, super interesting.
yeah.
And in the United States, um, among Protestants and Catholics, there's a lot of sort of post-liberal chatter about civilizational Christianity.
Hmm.
And of course, Ireland, for many, for a long time, Ireland was the end of the earth, of course. It
Hmm.
was, I mean, the earth was
Yep,
Eurasia and
yep,
Africa, and so Ireland is the end of the
yeah,
earth.
yeah.
It's and even though we might not be, as is so often the case, we know the most about those that wrote, and we still have their writings.
Hmm.
And probably many of the people who were illiterate or didn't write books, et cetera, et cetera,
Yeah,
it's hard for us to know, but we do know by virtue that Ireland, that there was a shape to the piety and to the
yeah.
faith that was preserved century after century,
Yes,
and that of course was not disconnected from the religious elites and the religious leaders who were, for their own reasons, had to continually do this religious life of the mind
yeah.
to try to be faithful in terms of their leadership of the church. What kind of a this topic of civilizational Christianity is a huge one, and it can be framed in a lot of different ways. But right now, I think all of the West, if and by the West I sort of mean the places in the world that Latin Christendom's legacy has been,
Hmm.
very impactful. and it seems like Ireland now is in some ways similar to Quebec. It's very interesting because Quebec and Ireland, these were two of the
Yeah,
most, deeply Catholic um, regions going into the late 20th century,
yeah,
whereas France, Spain, some of these other deeply Catholic places had quite a bit of turmoil.
yep.
Um, how and again, it's also very interesting that probably for since the creation of the internet, the overhearing the chatter of monastics and leaders throughout the centuries is
Mm,
now accessible
yeah.
to a far larger range in the stack of people all up and down the church, but also in a context of enormous religious pluralism and
Hmm.
pluralization. So how and now you, I mean, because as you enter into vocation, anyone who enters into a meaningful vocation has to ask themselves, okay, where does my vocation meaningfully interact into the much broader context I'm working in?
Mm.
Where, how do you see um, the Roman Catholic Church in Ireland engaging in the current questions of civilizational Christianity with respect to, you can't speak about the whole, obviously, we all only see little bits, but what do you see in that area?
I think it's exceptionally feeble at the moment. I think
Hmm.
that's just to be frank, um, and I would say, the main sense at a popular level among people like my age and older. I'd say a fairly common attitude to the church is just kind of disgust, and disgust at really serious scandals that deserve disgust.
Hmm.
Um, but there's a sense in which people are kind of saying, well, to hell with all of that. That's all a waste of time. It's all about kind of clergy serving themselves and so on, and there was nothing truly idealistic or sincere ever in that whole system. And I think that's, when it's historically, it's not the case. When you look back to kind of Catholic Ireland, there were very dark underbellies there, and really terrible abuses of power that lasted a very, very long time and led to immense suffering. Um, and at the same time, there were extraordinary ideals, absolutely extraordinary. I mean, if you look at the example of the Legion of Mary, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but a lay organization that's very much based on the idea of missionary discipleship, um, and just going door to door, in an Irish context, but then missionary beyond Ireland as well. And the shelter that I mentioned that I was chaplain to was a homeless shelter for women, which is run without interruption for 90 years, 365 days a year by members of the Legion of Mary. So they're kind of born in the heart of Catholic Ireland, just utterly idealistic and sincere. And you had so many missionary vocations coming from that. Young people who just gave up everything and left home thinking that they would never return. I mean,
Hmm.
this is quite common in the 40s and 50s. Young people left home, went to India or Africa or wherever it might be, and they were confident that they would never see their families again.
Hmm.
Which is, people don't do that purely out of a sense of serving the system or being served by the system. So,
Yeah.
in any case, I'd say the overall attitude, as I said, is kind of disgust with regard to the church, um, and at the same time, then there's a sense of appreciation of the local church, especially at times of tragedy. So, I mean, just yesterday, I was at the funeral or the removal of a man. His funeral took place this morning, um, and the Irish the Irish do funerals very, very well, and we do death very well. This is a man in his 60s who died, and his wife is very involved in our church here. And it wasn't in our church, the funeral, but I was queuing for about half an hour to get into the church. And in the church, it was just jam packed and had been packed for hours of people cycling through. Um, and it is unimaginable that for those people there that such an event could have taken place outside of a church. I think people are very slow to move to kind of a humanist environment for funerals and weddings. It's happening. It is happening. But I still think there's a sense of the church is where we belong at times of great joy and at times of great sorrow. But broadly speaking, there's a broad attitude of indifference. Now, I'd say among younger people, there's a greater sense of curiosity, and in a sense, they're not clued into the Catholic thing. They're not clued into the Christian thing really all that well, even though they're all going to Catholic schools. But occasionally that's a bit of an inoculation. So they get a tiny dose, and they think that this is all there is, and it's not all that impressive, and they move on. So if it wasn't for the internet, I think I probably wouldn't have really grown in my faith. I had a really, really good school experience, but I had real doubts that weren't addressed, in my Catholic schooling. So I'd say, yeah, I'm kind of rambling a wee bit, but I'd say that that broadly speaking, you're dealing with indifference, except at times of crisis, and then there's this growing curiosity among young people whom I encounter. Yeah, there's still a very high degree of cultural Catholicism. I'd say very little exposure in any generation to the intellectual riches of Catholicism. So I've given a few talks to teachers in Catholic schools where I encourage them to regard Dante and medieval literature of all kinds and the music of Mozart and so on, to regard all of that as part of our Catholic patrimony that we should be communicating and interpreting in light of our Catholic faith. And occasionally they look at me like I have two heads. I mean, it's just, it doesn't, these things don't connect for people. And for me, it was really going to England that I really connected with the intellectual riches of our faith. Yeah, so I'm very committed to kind of that dimension of mission, just exposing people to the intellectual beauty of the faith. And it's often very surprising for people. The Thomistic Institute is something that's doing it now on campuses in Ireland. I don't know if you're familiar with the Thomistic Institute. They organize lectures on campuses, secular campuses, and it's fascinating to see that grow. They're intellectually challenging lectures, nothing dumbed down about them whatsoever. They're theologically rich in kind of literary references or science and so on. But in Trinity College Dublin, it started off very small, maybe 10 people going to a lecture. I was there giving a lecture. There's about 100. Father Gregory Pine was there recently. There were 200 people in the lecture theatre. So this is a fascinating thing to see. And it's something that, as I said, people are not familiar with. Nor are we particularly familiar in Ireland with liturgical beauty. So this is another weak dimension of late 20th century and early 21st century Irish Catholicism, is the liturgy is often quite poor. So there's a lot of work to do. But the Lord is in charge.
Okay. One of the things that I've been noticing, especially among, let's say, this Orthodox moment that we're watching, is the rise of the involvement of the laity. Now, both you and I are clergy, but it's interesting to me that some of the most famous Orthodox, and there seem to be more and more famous Orthodox people on spaces like YouTube, they're laity. They're not clergy.
Yeah.
And, I think about that in terms of we're definitely in an anti-institutional era where, and this is true of Protestants as well, where people say, I don't want to, I distrust a system. I distrust anything that's overly organized.
Yeah.
And so they tend to instinctively open up more quickly to something that seems bottom up. And so it's interesting that this lay organization that you just mentioned, Legion of Mary, very interesting name.
Yeah.
And I suspect we'll see that. One of the things that I've been playing with this word on my YouTube channel. I call it metagelical, because
I just listened to your podcast about that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because evangelicals tended to be Protestants, but when I look at something like Word on Fire, Bishop Barron, although
Yeah,
of course he's a Roman Catholic bishop,
yeah,
but Word on Fire to me strikes me more something akin to, let's say, what I'd seen in Protestantism
mm,
as a parachurch.
hmm,
Word on Fire isn't run by I don't know which friars and nuns. It
yeah,
isn't
yeah,
run by people who have taken on ordination.
yeah,
And so, do you see this as part of what's happening
yeah.
too?
That's such an interesting question, and I was responsible for a short while for the social media output of the Irish Dominican friars, and I had a phone call with one of our French friars who's really making a big impact online. Paul Adrien is his name, and he's extraordinary. But his advice to me was not to run an institutional account. Now I didn't have a choice in that. I was under obedience. This is what I had to do, and I had to somehow represent all of the friars of the province and the kind of diversity and so on. But his argument was very strongly that the internet is a space where personality counts hugely, and people are attached to personalities. And he said it's difficult for him, and there are immense risks in this, and he's very aware of the risks. We function as community men, and it's really risky when a friar goes out on his own and develops his own personal apostolate. We're very concerned about these things, so he's very aware of that. But he has a personal account. He's always the one who's speaking to camera. He responds to things rapidly, which wouldn't be possible institutionally. And I think
Yeah,
that's something of a risk. And lay people are freer in a certain sense to respond rapidly to
yeah,
questions.
yeah,
They don't have to get the imprimatur from on high. So I think that's one reason for which laity are especially fitted to the kind of online mission in our time. And when you find, and I find this is a risk myself, in order to kind of to do well online, sometimes you have to be a little bit spicy and a little bit snarky. And I find myself doing that, and I'm kind of saying, why am I doing that? That's really not. It's not a good look for a priest, especially. And I think this is the challenge. As a priest, you have this pastoral sense. You are truly responsible for everybody who you come into contact with,
yeah,
in a
yeah,
way that a layperson isn't
yeah,
spiritually responsible in the same way.
yeah,
And so I have to be so careful online that I'm not smacking somebody down for a few likes.
yeah.
Um, and yet smacking people down for likes does seem to function well online.
Yeah,
So
that'll get the clicks.
it gets the clicks, and so I do think it's something that requires a lot of discernment. But then the dark side of that is that you have lay people who maybe don't have training, don't have accountability, who are claiming to represent Catholic teaching, and they're saying, well, Catholic teaching is that women have to have a dress that's like an inch above the ankle, and if not, they're in mortal sin. That kind of a thing. So um, I think they're really really challenging questions. But at the same time, I think the more I study history, the more I realize that every age has been an age of the laity, as well as an age of the clergy. And I mean, you touched on it. If the monasteries in early Christian Ireland were functioning, there has to have been massive lay commitment to these things,
Yeah,
massive lay commitment.
yeah,
Um, Families don't give their children to be monks and nuns unless they're really committed to this.
yeah.
And just one other example, I found it was really, really moving recently, a diary of a Dominican friar, a lay brother, so he wasn't a priest, from the late 19th, early 20th century. And he wrote in this diary a little biography of his father and of his mother. Um, and they're the most moving things I've ever read.
Wow.
He's describing these people who lived through the Great Famine. So his father had been a weaver, and was doing well. They lost everything. They had four boys in the family. They were literally just migrants in Connemara, going around cutting turf. Their animals all died. Just real living through the most intense suffering. People starving, literally starving around them. But throughout this time, the father worked as a catechist, and this was a totally voluntary thing. Nobody had trained him or asked him. But when he arrived in his parish and was raising his children, he taught the faith
Hmm.
to the local people, and we're told in the church and also in his home. He's teaching the faith to the local people, and that this becomes so popular that it had to take place in a field outside his home. And
Hmm.
this is in the wilds of Connemara, and just totally self-motivated. This is a man living out his baptism and his confirmation. And not only that, he wrote songs in Irish, which are recorded in this little diary. He wrote songs in Irish so that people could sing them and remember the key truths of the faith.
Hmm.
And the mother, there was a certain time when they were living 10 miles from the nearest church. So all the boys were walking to 10 miles there and 10 miles back. But the mother stayed at home with the local women, and they prayed on that day so that the whole day would be kept holy, he says.
Hmm.
And she would tell them stories that would make them think of heaven.
Hmm.
And again, like I said, these are people who are on the edge of starvation. And these are lay people who are utterly committed to living out their baptism and confirmation at a time when people would say, oh, that was the age of the clergy. No, I mean, every age of Christian flourishing is an age of the laity.
Oh, that's a beautiful point. I think you should I think if you'd make some YouTube videos translating and communicating those diaries.
Yeah.
I'm not saying you'll be Mr. Beast, but I don't think you
No.
want to be Mr. Beast. But I think that would that kind of thing can bless the world, because that's
Yeah.
a tremendously moving story. And I think you're exactly right. I think part of the difficulty that we have reading back in history again is this bias that the laity didn't write like like the clergy
Yeah.
wrote, and clergy have long been trained in the tools of of what would become the Academy of
Hmm.
Letters. And so
Hmm.
that's what we have. And so we have this huge blind spot in terms of
Yeah.
the really the life of the church that
Yeah.
we just have to sort of read into to try to see, because we don't have their voices like we have clergy voices.
Exactly that. It's just these tiny little glimpses you get of occasional voices that you find. Just one other example, a letter I found in the National Archives in London. It had been totally misidentified online, and I was looking for something else, and I found this letter written in Latin, and translated. It was 1572, and it was a woman from Galway in Lisbon, and this is a lay woman, and she's writing to the Dominican friars, who have just come under increasing pressure. They've been just kicked out of their friary, not here in Galway, but just outside in Athenry. And she's the wife of a Portuguese merchant, and she's writing to them saying, "Whatever you do, stay faithful to your vows."
Hmm.
She's rebuking them, and she's saying, "Do not abandon this way of life that you're committed to." And she quotes a psalm at the top. About fulfilling our vows. I can't remember the exact psalm, but again, this is the voice of a laywoman in the Reformation era who is calling on these men, and she's saying, "Come to Portugal. I'll look after you. There's
Hmm.
great universities here. You'll be ready then to go back on mission." So again, just this voice that we don't have another example of that voice, and we couldn't have imagined that she would be so educated, so scripturally informed, and so organized, and so confident in telling these priests what to do and what not to do. It's really, really surprising. So, as you said, you can fill in the gaps of the past in ways that are sometimes just not actually true.
So one of the things I did want to talk to you about is when we talked in our little meeting that we had to organize this event. You mentioned that you had read John Calvin,
Oh, I
and
love John Calvin.
and you didn't say horrible things about John Calvin. So how did you run across John Calvin, and what are some of your what are some of your takeaways after reading Calvin?
Yeah, well, it kind of relates to what I'm studying at the moment, in terms of Paul's letters and so on. So when I was I was sent to study in Freiburg in Switzerland, where the Dominicans run the theology faculty, and I had to pick a subject to study. And I knew I was going to work on Thomas Aquinas. My one of my teachers there was Gilles Emery, who was one of the greatest living Thomistic theologians, really wonderful exponent of Thomas's Trinitarian theology. And I said, well, I'm in Switzerland. So it was around 2017, or was coming up to 2017, the 500th anniversary of the Reformation. Mind you, the Swiss Reformed weren't all that interested in Calvin. I noticed that they kind
Huh.
of regarded the Reformation as important as a step on the way to modernity and post-modernity, and to be celebrated in that sense. I was interested, though, in going back to the classic texts of Protestantism. and doing comparative reading. And I thought, well, I got to pick a kind of a theme that is going to cut across a few different kind of theological doctrines. So I chose the theme of Christ as head of the church, because it relates to kind of soteriology and ecclesiology and the sacraments and so on. And this theme that's so strong in Paul's letters, the letter to the Ephesians, Colossians, Romans, First Corinthians, it's kind of there through all of them. And I said, well, I'll work on Calvin and Aquinas, because I almost expected them to be, polar opposites, because, Aquinas is the big Catholic theologian. Calvin is, in a sense, the big Protestant theologian. And because of that, we expect them to be at polar opposites. But actually what I found was, not only do they work really well to compare them, but actually there's really surprising points of contact. And comparing them is easy because both of them are systematic theologians. They wrote systematic works, which were kind of, where they thought carefully about how to organize the presentation of the mysteries of the faith, the Summa Theologiae or in the Institutions, which Calvin wrote and rewrote again and again, reorganizing again and again.
Yeah.
And Thomas, when he writes the Summa Theologiae at the start, he says the reason he's writing this in part is because other summae have not honored the kind of the proper presentation of the mysteries. So they haven't kind of organized them properly. So they both had this concern for organization, but both of them also were careful commentators on Scripture. And so what you can do is you pick any particular John 1:1 and look at what Aquinas says in his commentary on John, look at what Calvin says in his commentary on John, then look at how it plays out in the Institutions and the Summa Theologiae, and you have a very rich way of comparing them. And I found Calvin, obviously there's times when, as a Catholic reading Calvin, you have to kind of bite your tongue and just be patient. And I think we have to be patient when we're reading theologians in kind of contrasting traditions. A certain amount of patience is required, and to ask not only what is he saying, what are his conclusions, but what is he aiming at? What are his theological concerns? What are his theological principles? And there, I was amazed. I'd been kind of told that for Calvin, the true church is invisible, so he has no interest in the visibility of the church. And it's like this opposite of Catholicism. Actually, that's completely wrong. Like Book 4 of the Institutions, he's so keen on the visibility of the church, and on the importance of ministry and sacraments and preaching, and so many of his principles that he uses there are perfectly applicable in Catholic theology, and they're the same principles that God in his wisdom chose and chooses to work through instruments, which is exactly what Thomas says about the sacraments and about ministry and so on. It was a really, really fascinating thing. It kind of sharpened also the really important disagreements became kind of really evident to me also. But there were huge amounts of continuity. And just one example, again, we think sometimes of the Reformers as being kind of not, just kind of in utter discontinuity with medieval theology. But there's some wonderful examples that show how Calvin is relying on the medieval exegetical tradition more than he lets on. And this I found, and I haven't seen anybody commenting on this, but in Calvin's commentary on John, in the prologue to John's Gospel, he speaks about Christ's fullness of grace, so Christ is full of grace and truth. And he then says, he says, okay, Saint Stephen from Acts is also full of grace, but full of grace in a different sense. Straight away reading that, I said, Calvin here is doing exactly what the medievals did, because when they spoke of Christ's fullness of grace, they always compared and contrasted it with the sense in which Mary was full of grace and the sense in which Stephen was full of grace. Because in Acts chapter 9 or whatever it is, Stephen is described as full of grace and power. But the reason I knew Calvin certainly was relying on medieval exegesis there is because if you look at his commentary on Acts, what does his text of Acts say? Not that Stephen was full of grace and power, but it is a variant reading, full of faith and power. So in other words, when Calvin is writing in his commentary on John about Stephen being full of grace and power, it's not because he's coming across it in his text of Acts. It's because he's actually relying on an older exegetical tradition of John's Gospel. And he used, I think, Nicholas of Lyra and other compilators of commentary. So I found Calvin to be surprisingly Catholic in many ways. I know that's not a major discovery to somebody like yourself. There's all this rediscovery of Calvin's Catholicity.
Yeah.
I mean, his Christology is so concerned to be kind of patristic, to be conciliar, and reading his commentary on John 1 and reading Aquinas' commentary on John 1, they both have these same Christological concerns, and he wants to be more careful than some earlier Lutheran theologians. So there's a sense in which Calvin, I think, is gathering up carefully some of the shards that had been maybe scattered a little bit in the white heat of the first generation of the Reformation. And even his interest in St. Bernard of Clairvaux, that blew my mind, that he loves Bernard, and he quotes him so often. And I just never imagined that. I was kind of partly inspired by Rowan Williams, his Hulsian lectures, which became Christ and Creation. And there he refers to Calvin as the last of the Greek fathers, kind of provocative title. But there he says that Calvin has a surprisingly Thomistic hinterland in his thought. And I tend to agree with that. It's not that he was reading Thomas Aquinas, but that somehow he had many of the same theological instincts. And interestingly, Jesuits, when they attacked Dominicans in our disputes over grace and free will, they referred to us as Calvinists. So there's a certain kinship there. Yep.
Well, that's just fascinating. Part of what happened in my own crazy journey once I started YouTube, Brett Sockhold, I had made a video where I had said something dismissive, and probably too uncharitable and ignorant about certain what I assumed to be Roman Catholic beliefs. And I have a fair number of Roman Catholic listeners. Some of them decided to correct me and did so in a productive way and said, why don't you watch this, and this,
right,
and see if you still think what you said there. And so then I began doing that, and I began really appreciating a much richer view of what I had thought. And then Brett Sockhold, who's the theologian of the Diocese of Regina, Canada, his mother had been watching me, and she pinged him and said, talk to this guy, send him your book. He had written a book on transubstantiation, which was a fairly detailed study of Luther and Calvin, and talking about how, I mean, sometimes the reformers were butting against something, but if you take a look at the broader context and some of the shifts of their assumptions, in many ways, I think this is, I see this happening now on a broader level too, in terms of conversations between Catholic and many Protestant theologians, that people are beginning to realize that, we got sideways at different points in history for all kinds of different reasons. And, maybe we shouldn't have, and maybe if we had known more, we would have seen past some of our big disputes. So,
I'm totally convinced of that, and I'm really convinced of the value for ecumenism of reading our classical theologians patiently, each other's classical theologians. And this, I mean, my great guru in this was a theologian by the name of Anna Williams, who taught me in Cambridge, and she was taught by George Lindbeck, and she used to always say to me, read the whole tradition and read it all charitably. And she would again and again and again, she would say that I might say something in an essay that was a bit dismissive of something in Luther, and she was an Anglo-Catholic who was teaching me Thomas Aquinas, and she would insist, she would say, no, read Luther carefully before you say something like that. And I was blessed to have somebody like that to kind of, in my youth, I mean, I was only like 20, 21, but just that sense of kind of respect for all the great classical theologians was really instilled in me. And I try to instill it in my students as well. I get all my students to read, bits of Luther, Calvin, Wycliffe, and it's not just a case of knowing the enemy, but also trying to understand. And even in our sacraments course, the first the first texts we read on the sacraments are by the Salvation Army and the Quakers, and why they don't have sacraments. And it's just to think with them, well, why,
Yeah,
what might they be missing? What
yeah.
is motivating them, and so on. Yeah, so I think it's really really helpful to do that.
Well, it's not too hard to remember that Calvin, Luther, Wycliffe, Huss, these were all deeply committed people to their church.
Yeah.
And and also, I mean, one of the things I read Carlos Ayre's Reformations about
Mm-hmm.
a year or two ago,
Mm.
which was a super helpful book for me because I tended to be brought up in a context the 1960s, 1970s. There's quite a bit more anti-Catholicism in my tradition in our communities, but it's fascinating, a long, detailed look at the Reformation period.
Mm.
I mean, astoundingly diverse, um, situations in Europe, and in a time when the world was changing rapidly, at least partly due to the discovery of the Americas.
Mm-hmm.
And, one of the things that it seems to me like one of the most obvious things that someone could point out was that um, these waves that we sort of call under this big lump sum, the Protestant Reformation,
Mm-hmm.
these are these are these are happening in fairly isolated segments
Mm-hmm.
of Europe.
Mm-hmm.
The situation in Italy, the situation in France, the situation in Spain, and then you've got the whole east of, Orthodox churches and,
Yeah.
this borderlands between. I mean, this is an enormously complex picture,
Yeah.
but by virtue of, let's say, our particular theological inheritance, we tend to focus like really narrowly
Yeah.
at these few things and not ask the question, well, why exactly was the Protestant Reformation such hot stuff in these few places,
Mm-hmm.
but in whole swaths of the church, it's just like
Yeah.
nothing,
Yeah.
nothing,
Yeah.
and why? And part of taking, just easing back on the polemical pressure
Yeah.
might lead someone to ask productive questions about, okay, well, and then when you look at something like the patchwork of, the Holy Roman Empire, I
Yeah.
just began a book on the 30 Years' War, which begins getting into just this nearly unimaginable geopolitical entity
Yeah.
that most of Europe was, and it's like,
Was.
do you
Was.
think anything of that had something to do with what
Yeah.
transpired? Of course it did.
Yeah. Sure. Sure. And I mean, it's interesting when you talk about um why the Reformation took hold in some places and not others. And when we'll be in the west of Ireland, I mean, the west of Ireland is a famous case where it really didn't, and over the centuries, how kind of adherence to Catholicism actually endured, even though it meant a great deal of material loss for people, which I think is worth reflecting on for Protestants and Catholics. And that as Catholics, we have to recognize in Catholic countries, there was a great deal of suffering for many Protestants and persecution of many Protestants. And to look calmly together at those stories, I think interesting. One reason why perhaps it failed in the west of Ireland, especially, is that the friars had been reformed. So there was a major reform movement in the friars in the late 15th century, early 16th century, among the Franciscans, Dominicans, Augustinian friars especially, and they were passionate about preaching the gospel, high standards of living in all these Irish-speaking areas along the west coast of Ireland. Um, and so, in a certain sense, many of the things that Luther was calling for were already being lived out to a relatively high standard in the west of Ireland, and the friars had immense moral authority, and had the loyalty of the people in all these areas. So that's a very very interesting part of the story for sure. Um, yeah,
Well,
yeah.
it's. I was just listening to Louise Perry had a very interesting guest on. Um, I forget his name right now, but he was an economist looking at religious change globally right
Mm-hmm.
now in the world. It's quite interesting, and so often the the health of the church is so utterly dependent on the faithfulness of the clergy.
Hmm.
If you have bad shepherds,
Yeah.
it's gonna be a mess,
Yeah.
and things are gonna start
Yeah.
really moving. But if you've got good, faithful clergy, and I don't just mean that in a narrow sense to
Yeah.
particular traditions, but in terms of the very deep, basic sense, do they love their people? Do they
Yeah.
sacrifice for their people? I
Yeah.
mean, it boils down to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind,
Yeah.
and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. If your
Totally.
leaders are doing that well,
Yeah.
you're going to have much more stability.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because people are loved and cared for.
For sure. For
So,
sure. And it's interesting in an Irish context that during those times of persecution, it was very much internationally. So we friars, we trained our men abroad, again to very high standards in Irish colleges all across Europe, and they came back uh, with that kind of sense of confidence and leadership and so on. It's a really really interesting history. I'm going to be visiting Leuven in Belgium very shortly for a conference, and that was one of the places where we sent men, coming from absolutely nothing and living in penury over there as well, but they returned with very high ideals, um, and willing to kind of to risk everything and to just to go around it and to be martyred. I mean, a great many of them were killed. So yeah, it'll be interesting to we can visit some sites associated with all of that story in Galway, when we're together.
what do you see as? I just had a conversation with Nathan Jacobs about, and we wandered into, clergy preparation and
Mm,
some of those topics. What do you? It's so funny because to me, growing up on the East Coast of the United States, uh, you almost assume that if there's a Catholic priest around, he'll have an Irish accent.
yeah,
I mean that's almost a trope
yeah,
in at least late 20th century Catholicism
yeah,
because the Irish sent so many clergy abroad. What's happening now in terms of um, leadership development and training? And because if a church is going to at least hold its own, if not grow, they're
yeah.
going to need to be the multiplication of good leaders, as we just said. So what do you see happening right now in terms of the church? And because it's a on one hand on one hand we're seeing a moment when people out in society are only respecting leaders that demonstrate sacrifice,
Yeah,
because sacrifice is sort of a clue to people of authenticity, because it's
yeah,
like, hey, if you're taking these vows,
yeah,
you're taking it seriously because this comes at a cost to you. But
yeah,
at the same time, that cuts both ways because, okay, you want to be a leader, the
yeah,
bar is set high, which
yeah,
means.
yeah.
So how do you see that happening?
That's an interesting question. And my phone is dying here, so we better not
Oh,
stay
okay.
too long. But I'm reminded of something a comedian said, Tommy Tiernan, who's actually I think he's connected with Martin Shaw a few times. He's interviewed him on his show, and he's very interesting things to say. He's kind of one of these people who's kind of gently tiptoeing back to Christianity in different ways, having been very scornful in the past. But he has a comedy show where at a certain point he's talking about what he wants a priest to look like, and he says he doesn't want his priest to look like a bank manager. He wants a priest to look like the decisions he has made have had an impact on his face. Um, and he wants him to look like John the Baptist. He wants him to look like a wild prophet in the desert. Now, I don't look very, but I probably look more like a bank manager than like John the Baptist. But I think that's certainly an interesting point. And in terms of what's being done for leadership, I think in Ireland we're just at a really difficult time where there's a massive decline in the numbers of
Mm,
clergy relative to the amount of work. So
mm,
because there's still this great cultural Catholicism, there's a huge demand for funerals, weddings, and so on. So I would say priests are being increasingly thinly spread,
mm,
um, and have less and less and less time to think about the quality of their leadership,
mm.
which is a really dangerous place to be, and
Yeah.
I'm really concerned about that. So I'm blessed. Just in a few days' time, I'll be speaking to some priests in a diocese, and they are taking an afternoon together just to think about their life, their kind of spiritual lives. And one thing that I'll be really emphasizing with them is And before they're spiritual fathers, they are sons, and they are brothers, and they
Yeah.
need in prayer to understand themselves as sons of the Most High God, to constantly return to that identity, which is foundational, and also to have spiritual brotherhood. And for those priests who have spiritual brotherhood, and by that I mean, not just people who look up to you as a priest and request things from you as a priest, but people who are, that you could have a kind of an equal relationship with, a
Yeah.
conversation with, people who call you out. And in the Dominican way of life, we have that just built into the structure, and it's an immense blessing. For diocesan clergy, they tend not to. The ones I know who are flourishing are ones who have that kind of brotherhood in their lives.
Yeah.
And that's, I think that's really, really vital. But unfortunately, it's very rare. It's, as I said, it's a dangerous time. It's a really challenging time for the church in Ireland, and things will have to get worse and fall apart a little bit more, I think. And we'll have to see churches just being closed and rotting.
Mm.
And I think the people will be shocked by that,
Yeah.
because people presume that their church is always going to stay open.
Yes.
Not going to happen.
Yep.
10 years' time, we're going to be a very, very different scene in terms of buildings. Um, and my prayer and my hope is that bishops will lead in such a way that the priestly lifestyle will become a bit more livable, and have a bit more space for reflection on leadership and the spiritual life, and not just being a sacramental machine.
Wow. Amen. Amen. That was beautiful. That was beautiful. Well, we're going to land the plane because I want to say thank you before your phone dies. But
Yeah, well, thank you, Paul, and thank you for all the work you do, all the conversations you have, and thanks for thinking about the nature of conversation in the heart of the church. I think that's so important, and not just in the heart of the church, but on the fringes of the church as well. It's
yeah.
really, really an important thing to do.
Right. Well, thank you, Conor. I really look forward to meeting you in person and seeing your place of ministry. And I will pray that God bless your work richly.
Likewise.
Thank you, Conor. Take care.
You know.
Bye bye.